All right, good day, everybody. This is Randy DeGirolamo. Welcome to God's Balancing Act. And today I'm just joyed to have my friend Rob Carter join us. Rob and I have known each other about, I'd say, easy 35 years through our corporate America time at FedEx. And he's joined me today. So welcome, Rob. I'm glad to have you.
Well, it's a delight to be here, Randy. Thank you for asking me. I'm really excited about the idea of balance, and so many things happen in life that throw us off balance, and nothing better than to get great perspectives from people that have figured out some of that. And I can't say that I have, but I love talking about it.
Yes, and I know, and that's what kind of, for the viewers, me as well, that's what makes us so unique is everyone's journey's different, even though the center point is how God really brought that balance for us. But everybody's story is so unique and individual. So again, we've known each other for ages, probably a lot of the Memphis area knows you, but for our audience, our listening audience, just a little, as we said, a little elevator speech about Rob Carter and so forth, if you don't mind.
Well, sure. So I was a FedEx executive for a little over 30 years, and that's how I got to know Randy, as well as the fact that our kids were together in school for many of those years. They kind of tracked together. So Ellen and Randy have been friends and colleagues for a very long time. But my journey is really an interesting one. I grew up a military brat, lived all over the world as a kid, and finally settled in Central Florida and loved being there, went to the University of Florida for my undergraduate school and started my career in technology. It was really a choice that I made because, frankly, I was failing out of pre-med, which was my initial ambition, and it didn't work well, but God had other plans. But I switched to computer science and then spent my entire career as a technologist, ultimately at FedEx as both the CTO in the late 90s and then the CIO for almost 25 years from 2000 until 2024. The vast majority of those years getting to work directly for Fred Smith, my great friend and mentor across time. But we'll talk about my Christian walk as well. But the snapshot is I have 5 kids, these days 8 grandchildren, which is kind of amazing because the oldest one is 9. So they came in a hurry, but
Yes.
have a great family balance and really have enjoyed a great career, and am doing some interesting things these days as well.
Oh, that's good. That's real good. Okay. So I think we'll talk more kind of towards the end of the podcast about some of those things you're doing now. More is, again, I wanted to level set. Who is Rob Carter? Right. And that was a great intro. So, and you kind of mentioned it, and I know at times you and I have talked about this. Can you kind of describe for the audience your journey to Christianity? So again, some people have always stayed in the faith, some weren't in the faith, some drifted off in college, very common nowadays and so forth. So talk a little bit about your journey to becoming a Christian.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, and it's one that gives me a lot of perspective on a lot of different lifestyles and empathy for people's walks in this life, and what, including the time they spent away from God. But I really didn't grow up what you would call churched. It wasn't unusual for us as a family to go to church when I was a kid from time to time, maybe holidays or whatever, but we weren't particularly a church family. We didn't oppose the church in any way. It wasn't an anti-church thing, but it wasn't really who we were back in those days, and it certainly wasn't who I was and who I became as a teenager and a young man. I was really quite far from a walk with God in my teenage and high school years, and then ultimately in college as well. It was pretty much a self-centered life, trying to figure out what was in it for me. And, a lot of that was a bumpy road. I mean, bumpier than I even care to talk about right now because, it's not something I'm particularly proud of, and it's not something that's particularly redeeming to talk about, but it wasn't a direct path, and it wasn't that I was seeking God during those days. I was seeking the world, frankly,
Mm-hmm.
and I had found it, and I found it in my mid-20s is really when I kind of had this emptiness creep into my life where I just felt like there had to be something more. There had to be more to life than, kind of hedonistic pleasures or, I was out of college by then. I was making decent money for a young person, but it just seemed particularly unfulfilling. So I would call myself at that point in time a seeker. And I had a really good friend, Randy, who was sort of a partner in crime for me. We would go out at night, and especially on the weekends and look for trouble. I'll put it that way. And my friend Pat Doyle, um, and he seriously had a drinking problem. There was no question about Pat. His Irish guy was kind of in his blood, but he went through this snap turn. I'll call it these days a road to Damascus, getting knocked off his horse, salvation that I just witnessed firsthand. And it was confounding to me. I didn't really understand it. But in the blink of an eye, Pat turned into a different person. He seemed to have lost all the desire to drink, to party, is maybe the best worldly word for it. And it was interesting to watch for me because Pat actually had some challenges from that other side of his life. But Pat began to witness to me, began to share tapes with me and different things. And, this was all during that same seeker time. And I'll try to not make this too long, but I was literally reading this book by Shirley MacLaine called Out on a Limb. It's a very humanistic, I don't even know what to call that perspective, but there was a chapter in the book where Shirley talked about Jesus as that clearly he was a wise man. Clearly he was, someone who, could do many things, but she really attributed all of that simply to his humanity. And meanwhile, at the very same time, I was listening to tapes that Pat had given me, my friend Pat Doyle, and these were pretty intense tapes. These were tapes by Kenneth Hagin and Kenneth Copeland, and so they were sort of deep charismatic Christianity, and so it was completely juxtaposed to what I read in this book.
Right.
And I asked this question. I'm by myself in my house at home one night reading the book, and I just put it down and I said, Lord, I said, God, I don't know what to believe. And I had the strangest moment in my life where God just revealed to me his presence. And, I can't even, it was so personal, I can't really describe that. But as a 25-year-old who had really never, been churched and never really had any kind of a salvation moment in my life, I found myself by myself on my knees in my living room, and my life changed forever at that moment. It was a moment in time. I mean, it truly was what in my life, it was being saved from my own behavior, from my own, missteps and beliefs and sin, and having a revelation of who Jesus really was, which was something I had resisted greatly up to that point in time. So my life changed, my career changed, my path changed, and I get to say to myself all the time when I see, people with some significant challenges through their lives, there but for the grace of God go I.
Hmm. I do remember early on when we met, we never really did talk about your testimony. You just said, Randy, it was dramatic for me. It was a dramatic shift, a total 180. And again, for me, a similar time frame, age 25, but it was more, I was just on again, I had that path of nightclubs and going out and this and that, but had a heart for God, but didn't know how to get there. Right. And anyways, as I've shared on other podcast, all of a sudden my parents started going to an AG church down in Florida, and I'm up here already working for FedEx. I'm 25, and I'm like, well, let me see if they practice what they preach. Let me go where I don't know anybody and see. And at that time I lived over by the University of Memphis, and the church I still attend, First Assembly Memphis, was on Highland at that time. And I went one Sunday as a New Year's resolution. I said, let me go give it a try. And long and short, Not to go into my testimony, but yeah, it took because of people reaching out, welcoming me in, following up, being able to ask questions of why do we believe this, why that, and people answering in a nice way, right? Not saying, "Oh, you dummy, you need it." No, they would explain it and go through it with me. So that's exciting.
There's one thing I'd like to share with the listeners because there are people out there who are really good at planting seeds. And one of the things that happened in that moment on my knees was that all of these events in my life, and there had been several of them, where, a friend had taken me to church when I was a teenager and, kind of dragged me in there. And something that the pastor said really resonated with me and pricked my heart. There was another time when I went to a concert at a place down in St. Petersburg, Florida, where I was living. Never been to a Christian concert, didn't know there was such a thing, but a friend's older brother took us there. And the Holy Spirit was there in a big way and pricked my heart. There was another time where I was visiting a friend down in South Florida, and he had promised we were going to go meet his parents at church. And, we had been out very late, but there was a lady that sat next to me that immediately kind of began to witness to me in church after, after it was broken up. And none of those were the points in time where my life changed. But I can tell you, and I can promise people who are good at those kinds of seed planting, that all of those things rushed back into my mind at that moment when I was on my knees. Those points in time where God had, through people, revealed himself to me in a way that would become much more significant later than it was in the moment. But I believe that those seeds fell on fertile ground at that point in time and began to take root long before that moment in my living room.
Rob, that's such a great point, and it's a great encouragement for people. We were talking about it with a group of friends this week and about, again, some plant, some water, and then the Lord in the harvest. And that's a great example of that in your life. So thank you for sharing. I think, I kind of like to ask this with the journey too, because again, when I reflect on my journey, again, we just talked about seed planters, but also there's the people who watered. I'll use that analogy and just had a huge impact. So it almost sounds like it's your friend Patrick Doyle. But is there any other person or thing that had an impactful, like great influence, or maybe, yeah, he got me there, and then after I became, this person shepherded me, or so it's kind of along the lines who had, and it doesn't have to be limited to one person, but who had great influence on you as Christian?
Yeah, I had to think about that pretty hard because there have been a lot of people. There have been, personalities, pastors and ministers, at at a Promise Keepers event that I went
Mm,
to, or I used to listen to Jack Hayford on the way to work every day, and Living Way was just something that I loved, so I could talk about that. But I want to talk about something a little more personal because, I'm thinking about this. So similar to you, after this experience, I said, well, I guess I better go to church.
yeah.
And there was a church that was close to my house, and so I darkened the doorway of that place by myself a little bit later, and I filled out the card in the church, and lo and behold, a week later, there's a knock at the door, and Dave is standing there. I'm just going to go with Dave. Dave was part of an evangelism explosion team at the church at that point in time, and for those of you that know Evangelism Explosion, it's a pretty cool thing. Teaches you how to share the gospel, and it makes you pretty bold about just going on, and knocking on people's doors. Well, you know, at that point in time, through the revelation that God had given me, I actually knew the answers to the question. I knew, why
Mhm.
why I would knew that Jesus had died for my sins, and I got the answers to the questions right. But then, so it wasn't a salvation moment for them, but it let them know, that as I was sitting there in the church, that, that I had truly crossed over to becoming a heart-based Christian, not a head-based Christian.
Yes.
I know that I know that I know is kind of where I was at that point in time. But shortly after that, Dave started something at the church. So Dave actually worked as the maintenance director for that church. He was a fairly simple guy. He and his wife had two kids, in a modest house, but he started something that was, some people may know about this program too, but it's by the Navigators and it's called 2-7. And it's a discipleship program based on Colossians 2:7, which says, rooted in him, strengthened and built up in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. That's the root of the 2-7 program. But Dave poured a lot of himself into this. It's a year-long program of scripture memorization, of true discipleship. It takes work and it takes commitment to plow your way through the 2-7 chapters and all the work that's done there. And when I think back on my walk these now past 40 years, I'm not sure anything had a deeper impact on me than going through the Navigators 2-7 program. And if it's, if something people are curious about, it's still out there, as a ministry on the web, you can go look at it. But the point being is that Dave committed himself from his layperson seat in the church to become uh, uh, something of an apostle to lead discipleship, programs. And there were a lot of us that experienced it and gained greatly from it. And it anchored me, rooted in him and strengthened, built up in the faith as you were taught. Those things got me through some pretty intense storms in my life after that.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Of course, anytime when someone shares, it piques memories, right? And I remember, again, early in my walk, there was a couple at our church, Tom and Diane Good. They lived, a couple blocks from the church. And man, there was just a group of us. It was just new Christians. I don't think they called it new Christians, but they had a Bible study at their house once a week. And one of my closest friends, a guy named Steve Workman, was in there. A guy named Cliff Higdon, you may have known Cliff from FedEx. He was in there, and others. And they walked us through, because again, I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I'll say I'm nominal Catholic. The message of salvation, Jesus is your Lord, was there, but we weren't just as active, right? So we didn't read the Bible, long and short, in our family and in our household. And all of a sudden you start reading and you have someone to explain it. And another person popped up in my mind. His name's George Carnell. He and his wife, Jan, he was with Fantastic Sam's, which I think was a hair salon, type of things. And whenever we go, how you doing, George? He'd go, fantastic. But he took a group of us through the book of Proverbs, and he had a lawyer background. So he was like their, general counsel, even though I don't know how large the organization was, but basically it was the general counsel for Fantastic Sam's back in the 80s. And so he had a much more in-depth knowledge, and he was an in-depth, and your point, right? We'd go, well, what does this proverb mean? How does that imply in life? And so it's so critical, discipleship. I've mentioned before another one, I'm teaching in the book of Acts for our life group. And it's just so clear about the Great Commission, about discipleship, take care of the poor, take care of widows and those in needs. I mean, that's almost the core of it, right? But it comes from these foundational people in our lives who are important to us, who do that. So it's still critical today, is also the point. Those kind of things are just as essential as they were 35, 40 years ago. So
Totally agree.
So, dovetailing on that also, I'm always curious because, and again, for those who hear it, I probably say this all the time, tithing is kind of a formula for me. So I get that with my analytical mind, but prayer life, it's pray without ceasing. And I understand that. And I go, but how do you do that? So I always venture in conversation with people. What is your prayer life like? How does that work for you? I mean, I got, again, I got my prayer life formula that I'm doing right now. And I know I can always do more, but I think it's always good to hear, what is your prayer life and how do you manage in that time and space?
Well, it's a great question, and it's such an important question for us as we figure out how to balance and how to trust and how to be thankful and how to worship. Worship isn't something that happens on Sunday morning for 20 minutes. Worship is an act of worship through all of the things that we do in our life. But everything from, when I was in 2-7, back to that for just 1 second.
Yes.
part of the program was in each kind of chapter, we would actually have a day of prayer where we would go someplace in the city and we would kind of dispatch, individually, and you would spend hours in prayer. And so it taught you the depth of what God could reveal if you would quiet yourself and for him and with him to really go deep. But that's not the way we live out each day, but it is an experience everyone should have, is that time where you really take yourself apart. And another thing that happened was Pat Doyle and I, we went up to the Boundary Waters in Canada. We were both pretty new Christians. We went camping, but it was a canoe portage where we went into it's called Lake of the Woods up at the Canadian border, and we were there for a week. We saw no one. We fished to eat, and
Mm.
had an experience of really in the nighttime sky there was amazing, and God just revealed himself in some incredible ways. So I think it's important to have those times in your life where you sort of separate yourself from all the noise, all the clutter, all the anxiety, and really seek God for an extended period of time. But the question you asked is really different than that.
Mhm.
And so it's still, though, important to start your day, I think, with a quiet time. And so I'm probably on my sixth lap, and this may sound boring, but I'm on my sixth lap through Jesus Calling. And if people haven't used the Jesus Calling devotional by Sarah Young, I would highly recommend you get it and try it, because it's anointed. I can just tell you it is this unique way that this book is written in first person, as though Jesus is talking to you each morning. It's anointed because it finds you where you are virtually every day. And so I'm just lapping my way through it because it seems new every time, even though it's dated and you hit today's date and you read it, it feels like you've never read it before. Even though I've read, and I have a really good memory for what I read too. It's just one of those things. But there's something about this that morphs itself to where you are and what you need that day. But one of the things it constantly emphasizes is that pray always, pray without ceasing. And there are just simple little things that show up in the book that teach you how to call out to God in virtually every circumstance, how to be thankful in virtually every circumstance, how to not over plan, not over rotate, not to lean on your own understanding all the time, but
Mhm.
in all your ways acknowledge God, and he'll make your paths straight. And so for me, it's it's being grounded in the day with just a little bit of quiet time. It started, I'm not Catholic, but I love the Lenten season, and I
Mhm.
committed several years ago during Lent that what I was going to give up was a half hour of sleep. And so I gave up a half hour of sleep by getting up a half hour early and spending a half hour with God. And it became a really important part of my life, my balance, and my grounding to start each day with quiet time. And I love to get up before the rest of the house is up. I love it when it's quiet. And, I love going to that special place where I can sit and read and reflect and pray.
That's good. That's great. That's great. I yeah, I think that's inspiring. I like to start out early. I heard, there's all these different little anecdotes about prayer life and so forth, and I'm gonna paraphrase the one I heard, but it was like, when you're ready to play an orchestra, and you have a music that's getting ready to play, you don't tune your instrument when you're done. You tune it before you start. So, and they use that analogy, you should tune your day with the presence and time with God, not wait till the day is over and then say, "Hey, I look back and thank you," versus look forward to the thank you and being with me and guiding my thoughts and giving me wisdom and the right words to say and those kind of things. Right. So I agree. For me, I've shifted to where it used to be maybe various times, but it's the morning. That's when, for me, it's most fulfilling. And I tend to think I mean, you can receive it anytime. I get that, but I just tend to see maybe it's my body or whatever, but it works better for me when I start my day off with some time in the Word, trying to listen to the Lord and praying. It just sets the tone for the rest of the day.
I love that idea of like tuning the instrument, you know, I mean, getting set for the day. That's brilliant. I've got that one in my repertoire now. That's beautiful.
So, hey, so we're going to jump back a little bit to, again, I guess we will hopefully have time also to talk about what you're doing now. But in your days again, at FedEx, how was your faith manifested, demonstrated? How did it work for you? Was there always good balance or at times were you challenged? Just, again, for our listeners, right? Hey, yeah, I confess my Christianity. And I believe, most of the guests I have live it, but at times there's challenges, so how did that holistically play for you when you were there?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because it is yet another type of balancing act, I believe, because for me, it wasn't this, crazy overt thing. I didn't walk around with my Christianity right on my sleeve all the time. And, you know, I hope my language was peppered, with belief and, but so it wasn't extremely overt, but it definitely wasn't covert either. It wasn't something that I kept, under a bushel basket. It was one of those things that, I was never ashamed of the gospel. I was never ashamed of my Christianity. I had friends at church, including in the executive suite. I mean, I had friends at work, including in the executive suite, that, we could lean on each other as Christians and we would become accountability partners. But my great friend Mike Glenn said, witness always, use words only when necessary. And, I found that to be something revealing. Mike and I were business partners for many, many years, and we're still accountability partners, even though we've both retired from the work. But it was, that there's something about that, if you think that through, is like, let your life be your witness and only use words when necessary. That doesn't mean that you don't use them. And a lot of times in one-on-one settings, I had a philosophy at work, even though I was a corporate executive. I never turned down a single one-on-one request from anyone in the company, unless there was a very specific legal problem or something like that going on. I'll be, completely honest about it. There are certain times when you've been advised not to do that. But
Yes.
in sort of the day to day, if someone asked to sit down with me, I would invite them to the headquarters office and they would sit there in my office and we would talk. And there were clearly times in those settings where someone needed a word of encouragement
Mhm.
from God, or certainly from a godly perspective and from a witnessing perspective. But in general, the other thing that happened was I was active in church. I was often, a speaker in situations like this where, where it's not a mystery, where I got my energy from, where I got my faith and my balance from, what kept me grounded in spite of, tumultuous times in life and work and intense pressures and all of those things. So I was never afraid to say, look, the reason that I can do what I do. And by the way, at that moment in time when I was saved, when I was 25, my career changed so remarkably in such a short period of time. I was pretty much a, whatever, call it a, run of the mill programmer
Mhm.
when I was 25. And then before I was 30, I had been promoted 3 times and was a young managing director. And the company that I was at was leading a team of 300 people. And all of that, none of that was because, Rob Carter, it was all this God's grace, which, grace is, a really, really powerful thing because it's God's empowering presence that
Yes.
enables you to be who God created you to be and do what he's called you to do. So with that gracefulness that
I
comes
hear.
with following your calling, my career soared. And that was in fact my calling. Too many people think of calling only as the ministry of the church. And
For
and
sure.
calling is deeper and broader than that. I mean, God's used me in those business settings. God's used me for resources. I mean, not that he needs, it all belongs to him, but learning, how to be a giver and to, not give grudgingly or under compulsion, but with joyful hearts, changes the church and empowers the church in so many ways. So the real question, though, I'll get back to it here, is how do you walk that out in your career? And I always believed, and I still may be wrong. I'll know someday, face to face. But I always believed that the gentle touch was what my calling was, and that living a life where people would go, huh, he seems to have there's something about him,
Hmm.
that that seems to make him be able to be calm and give him, these opportunities. And that reveal, I always wanted people to understand that, and whenever asked the question directly, I always answered it honestly, is that, look, it's not me. It's God's grace in me. It's the life that I've chosen to live by faith in God that has empowered me and enabled me to do what I do because it's my calling.
Yes. Yeah, I love that. And it is, because we have our flesh warring against us, right? That wants me, achieve, 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 generally, right? That's what most. But then his grace, we know it's sufficient, but stronger, but guides us. Then you become at peace with Rob has a journey that God has for him, or God has a journey that's for Randy. God has a journey that's for Bill and Sam and Mary and so forth. Then you just become you have a peace, again, that peace that passes all understanding, because you're not judging yourself on the worldly's scale of achievement. You're walking in the grace of God that you're in a circle of influence that only Randy can reach. Rob's in a circle of influence that only Rob can reach, and that's part of the divine plan. And when you can really grasp that, life becomes simpler in a sense and not as stressful. It's joyful. There's bliss, there's happiness, because with a high degree of confidence, as I submit myself to the Lord, he's directing my paths and directing my steps for the plan he has for me and my family and so forth. Yeah, Rob, that's great.
Totally. I always am cautious about how I share this part of this because, I mean, there's nothing the matter with being ambitious, and I admire people who are ambitious, but I've seen so many people over time, so often, that just always reaching for the brass ring, never satisfied with where they are, and, wanting and, believing that they're a failure if they're not climbing that ladder. And I can honestly say that from the time that I became a first line manager shortly after I became a Christian to when I was an executive vice president at FedEx Corporation and the CEO of the shared services company and all of those things, I never applied for a job, never once. I only believed that my main purpose was doing the work that had been set in front of me with character, with honesty, with blood, sweat, and tears. I'm not saying that it was easy, that I was just, in Shangri-La skipping along. I mean, this is hard work, but my belief was need to, God has put me here. I need to make the most of what I can do. And then promotion and opportunity actually came and tapped me on the shoulder every time, and again, I have to be careful about that because I'm not saying that you should never go apply for a job or you should never go say, I'd love to go seek that promotion. But, in almost every case though, even as Christians, we say, God, is it okay? Can I go do that? And God will almost always say, sure, go do that. But what we really should be asking is, will you go with me? Will you go before me? Will you lead the way? Will you be Baal Perazim, the waymaker for me? Not because in that case, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. If you humble yourself and say, I can't do this on my own, but if you go before me, I can do this, then that's when you get that gracefulness. And I really believe that's an important form of the word grace is graceful. But there's another important
Mm,
form of the word that we ignore. And that is if sometimes we're stepping outside of the measure of grace that God is giving us, what we do then is fall into disgrace. And God will allow us to do that. And we can be taught a lot by moving outside of the grace covering that God gives us. But that's when disgrace happens, when grace does not feel present and your life is not moving smoothly like it does inside of your calling, inside of that graceful place that God would have you go.
yes. Yeah, because, again, I tend to think about, the, because I didn't wanna be dismissive of, yeah, don't go to apply, right? Don't go, because I always looked at it in my career as, okay, Lord, because at times I feel like, man, if I really am desiring something, sometimes it's really hard for me to hear from God because my emotions is, that would be really good. So I'd usually say, God, if this is not it, I'm at peace with the door being closed. I'm going to step this way, but if the door closes, I'm at peace with that. And that was kind of my formula, that really helped me because I really felt at times I said, man, that looks so cool, neat, desirous, whatever phrase of an opportunity. But I knew sometimes I would be blinded by that ambition. So I said, Lord, I trust you in if this door opens or closes, I'm at peace with that. Right.
I like that. I like that a lot, Randy.
Yeah, that was the methodology
That's a
that
great turn of that cube, that says, okay, is this a door you're opening for me that I should walk through or not?
mhm, yes. So Rob, let's see, 2 other things. One is, what's going on now in your life? And then we'll transition to the, kind of the keystone, question. Um, Post-retirement been, what did you say, 3 years roughly, I'd say, and I know just like we talked about with your life, you're an active person, so I know you got things going on, but it can be whatever space you wanna talk about with family, friends, work, we'll call it work stuff, but business stuff. Just what's going on currently with you?
Well, it's only been since the beginning of 25, so it's just a little over a year now, but I can tell you that I'm not very good at retirement.
Mm,
My wife told me that the other day. She goes, you're not very good at this because I'm too busy, and so I'm seeking balance now. But I'll tell you a quick story. I had a couple of great boards and some advisory roles that had come my way that, because I was kind of trying to plan my life out for a third, a third, and a third, a third
yes.
business type activities, a third civic and church activities, and a third family activities. I've got a lot going on there and it's not in balance with that right now. And this happened. So I was, 6 months in, I thought I had it right. But last year I got this very strange call from the Defense Department, and I wasn't expecting this call. And it was, hey, we're trying to put together a team of business leaders here at the Pentagon that can help us with specific expertise that they bring. And so I was curious and went and talked to them. But the very when I got back from that first trip, Fred Smith had called me and said, he always called me Sparks in the Marine Corps. You called the tech guy Sparky or
Mhm.
Sparks. And so he said, Sparks, come in and have lunch with me. We need to catch up. And so we had this wonderful lunch that, he was in his office and, and this was in June of 25. And I told him about this and he goes, well, I really think you should do that. I think that, first off, I think you could make a difference there. Second off, it would make me very proud if you went and did that work. And Randy, he passed away the next day. I got a call 24 hours later that Fred had passed suddenly. And I'll tell you, he was very lively and alive and everything. He wasn't ill, at that point in time. And so it landed on my shoulder at that point in time saying, "Sir, if it'll make you proud, I'll go do the work." So I'm spending a lot of time in Washington these days, spending time up there. All that work's classified, so can't really talk much about,
Sure. Yeah.
about what's going on, but you can read the newspaper and see that it's kind of a busy time these days.
Mhm.
So what that did was that took away a lot of my white space. I mean, I had white space for family and civic things, and I'm a little out of balance on that. So trying to figure it out, but I'm certainly not lacking things to do right
Mhm.
now because I've kept my boards, I've kept some of the advisor roles that I had, but I'm also doing this work in service to the government, which felt important to me at that point in time. So that's the slate, and it's not particularly in balance. And so I'm praying about it and seeking it. And if any of the listeners out there want to offer up a little, prayer for me, I'd appreciate that because I have to make sure I'm doing, the graceful thing and doing what God's called me to do.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Rob. Yes, that was very good. Very good. So as we're coming down, yeah, as we're coming down to balance, and again with my guess, I tend to view it's he did it for me here and I've sustained it, or it's a perpetual thing that he does for me. Again, kind of how does God provide balance, bring balance for you, Rob? And you shared a lot of good things. So I'm sorry to cut you off. So I could see a repeat coming in, but this is going to be good.
It is gonna be a repeat because, there's one tool in my life that just constantly calls me back to balance, constantly calls me back to trust, constantly calls me back to quiet, and it's Jesus calling. It's one of the main gifts that this devotional has is talking you out of being caught up in the swirl of the world, being caught up in busyness, being caught up in yourself, being caught up in not giving time, not finding space, not trusting God, not quieting your own ambitions. And so that last little chapter that I read may have sounded like I'm not paying any attention to that. But even in our walk with God, there are seasons when God
Yes.
calls us to intensity. I mean, that's just,
Hmm.
if you look at Paul's walk, I mean, there were some,
Yes.
pretty intense times there, and it was part of his calling for sure. But for me, I have to ground myself and I have to remind myself in the word and in my quiet time that it isn't all about me. It's not all, that it's about trust and it's about laying it all down and following God, not saying, or, looking back over my shoulder saying, "You here with me?" as I, run forward at breakneck pace. So quiet time is equal to balance for me as long as it's learning and leaning in on trusting God.
I think that's a great summation, Rob. So true, right? It's just so true. It's the quiet time, it's Jesus calling and him guiding and directing our steps and ensuring I find time for that. So we stay uh now I'm almost overusing the word stay balanced, right? But keep don't tilt one way too far or another in our own personal ambitions, and lose sight of what he has us here for. So, Rob, thanks for joining us today. Generally these podcasts are about 45, 50 minutes. So I think we're in there. And if you don't mind, I'll close us in prayer and pray exactly for the thing that you just talked about at the end with that.
Yeah, thank you.
Dear Lord, thank you for your goodness and mercy. And Lord, I thank you for my friend Rob. And I thank you that his willingness as a vessel to seek and listen to you. With that, you provide, keep his ship going straight and forward, dear Lord, not turning left or right, but providing that balance for him. And right now, with, again, Lord, the skills and talents you've blessed him with, there's a calling really in our community and in our country that is calling and using him, Lord. So I pray for that balance and that guidance to come so he understands, again, as he mentioned, civic, family, and business, and that you keep him in the right path, dear Lord. Bless his family, bless his health, dear Lord, and let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and redeemer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Randy. What a
All
what a
right.
treat it was to be here.
Yes, amen. Thanks, Rob. We'll see you soon.